Welcome to The Explainer, right? Let's jump straight into it. Today, we're exploring a site with an absolutely mesmerizing history, Highcliffe Castle. Now, we aren't just looking at some static, dusty old building today. No, we are unpacking a really dramatic, multi-generational story of eccentric creation, tragic ruin, and an incredible, against all odds, resurrection. It's a literal saga of diplomacy, architectural obsession, high society, and devastating fires, all perched right on the edge of the Dorset coast.
So, here's a wild question for you. How on earth do you build an English castle using French ruins? I know it sounds like a riddle, but it was the actual 1830s master plan of a very distinguished diplomat named Charles Stuart, the first Baron Stuart de Rothesay. He was the British ambassador to France, and when he decided to build a family home on the English coast, he didn't just want to use local stone. He had this wildly eccentric vision to physically transport actual pieces of European history across the English Channel to build his dream house. Talk about an ambitious DIY project, right?
But, before the castle could even be built, the land itself had to be conquered. Back in the 1770s, the famous landscape architect Capability Brown was brought in by the 3rd Earl of Bute to design a clifftop home right here. And at the time, it was just bare, windswept heathland. The Earl's wife actually complained that there wasn't a single tree on the territory to offer shelter. Brown literally had to plant heavy belts of Scotch firs and pines just to protect the property from those harsh, salty channel winds. Fast forward to the 1830s, and Lord Stuart de Rothesay, who was the Earl of Bute's grandson, has completely replaced that modest vision with a lush, towering Gothic Revival estate.
Now, the specific style Lord Stuart de Rothesay went with is just absolutely fascinating. Highcliffe is celebrated today as perhaps the most important surviving house of the Romantic and picturesque style of architecture. This whole aesthetic movement basically took rigid symmetry and threw it right out the window. It was all about emotion, drama, and intensely interacting with nature. You can really see this in the castle's L-shaped design. It's specifically oriented on a southeast axis so that the central oriel window provides this sweeping, dramatic vista straight across the landscaped gardens, right out to the Isle of Wight and the Needles. The whole thing was perfectly designed to provoke a sense of awe.
And here's where it gets even crazier. The foundations of Highcliffe Castle are quite literally intertwined with the French Revolution. In 1789, the Revolution tore through France, leaving incredible medieval structures in total ruin. Decades later, around 1830, Lord Stuart de Rothesay used his diplomatic connections in France to purchase this salvaged stonework, pack it onto ships, and sail it all the way to Dorset. By 1835, his architect, William Donnithorne, had masterfully pieced all these remnants together to complete Highcliffe Castle.
So what exactly was on those ships? Well, the building is essentially this beautiful, tactile Frankenstein's monster of medieval history. We're talking about incredibly ornate, carved stonework pulled from the ruined Benedictine Abbey of St. Peter at Jumièges, alongside majestic masonry salvaged from the Grand Massillon as Andelus in Normandy. They even managed to seamlessly integrate a salvaged 16th-century oriel window and historic stained glass directly into the masonry. It's literally a spectacular mosaic of French history sitting right there on the English coast.
Moving on to our next section, the women of Highcliffe, 4 stories long overlooked.
For the longest time, the history books really just obsessed over the barons and the earls. But currently, Highcliffe is hosting an exhibition that rightfully places 4 formidable women front and center. It explores how their vision, generosity, and sheer determination truly shaped the estate and its role in the community. Let's look at 3 of these prominent figures real quick. First, we have Louisa, the Marchioness of Waterford, who inherited the castle in 1867. She was a deeply accomplished painter who filled the halls with art and high society guests. Then there's Violet Stuart Wortley, who became the castle's longest ever resident. She married into the family in 1891 and chronicled their entire history in her books. And later, we have Rose Selfridge, a tenant during the First World War, whose immense philanthropy forever tied the castle to the local community. To really get a lived-in feel for what Highcliffe was like under Louisa's care, her own words capture it perfectly. Listen to what she writes in 1880. "I have had a great surprise in the unexpected visit of the Prince and Princess of Wales, drawing nets on the shore till evening. She notes that the princes were swimming in flannels, joining a steam tug in the sea. I mean, how fun is that? The crucial point here is that Louisa completely transformed this architectural marvel into a vibrant, living hub of high society, literally hosting future kings and queens for casual beach days."
Now, Violet Stuart Wortley's era definitely continued this tradition of international significance, but with a pretty different flavor. In 1907, she hosted the German Emperor Kaiser Wilhelm II for a highly publicized 3-week stay just so he could recover his health. To thank her, The Kaiser presented the castle with two beautifully crafted stained glass windows. It's honestly amazing to think that just a few short years later, Violet's husband, Major General Edward Stuart Wortley, would be fighting directly against his former houseguest's army in the First World War.
And speaking of the First World War, a staggering contrast took place on the estate during the tenancy of the famous American retail entrepreneur Harry Gordon Selfridge. You might know him as the guy who coined the phrase, "the customer is always right." Well, Harry rented Highcliffe from 1916 to 1922. He spent lavishly, putting in modern steam heating and throwing these massive, brilliant garden fetes with thousands of guests. But his wife, Rose Selfridge, took a completely different path. She joined the Red Cross and set up a tented convalescent camp right in the castle grounds to care for wounded American soldiers. Tragically, Rose's selfless work was cut short when she died in the devastating 1918 Spanish flu pandemic. Both of them are actually buried today in the nearby churchyard at Highcliffe.
Which brings us to our final section: fire, ruin, and rescue.
So, after all those decades of glamour and royal visits, the mid-20th century brought a really dark and tragic chapter. The whole era of massive, private grand estates was ending, and the building fell into the spiral of decline that almost wiped it off the map completely. In 1950, the family sold the castle. It briefly served as a children's convalescent home and later as a training center for student Catholic priests. But the maintenance costs were just immense, and by 1966, it was left completely vacant. Then, disaster struck. In 1967, a terrible fire badly damaged the Great Hall. The very next year, in 1968, a second fire ripped through the building, utterly destroying the grand staircase. The castle was left totally exposed to the weather, ravaged by vandals, and reduced to a highly vulnerable ruin.
Now, you're probably wondering, why wasn't this burnt-out shell just bulldozed by developers to build, I don't know, a block of apartments? The absolute crucial answer lies in its Grade 1 listed status. Highcliffe Castle had been officially recognized for its exceptional national architectural importance, specifically because of that romantic design and the salvaged Norman stonework we talked about earlier. This legal designation was an absolute shield. It explicitly blocked any form of demolition or unsympathetic development. What you really need to take away from this is that this piece of paper, this Grade 1 status, is quite literally the only reason Highcliffe Castle exists today.
Because demolition was off the table, local citizens, historians, and heritage groups rallied to save it. Step 1 of the rescue mission began in 1977 when the Christchurch Council made a compulsory purchase of the ruin for £65,000. For years, they struggled to get funding, but by 1990, protective scaffolding was finally wrapped around the crumbling stone. By 1994, English Heritage and the Council were able to begin a phased scheme to actually repair the south wing, literally brick by brick.
But here is the real game changer: £2.6 million. That was the massive grant awarded by the Heritage Lottery Fund to finally complete the major repairs. This phenomenal investment paid for master craftsmen to meticulously rebuild the demolished East Tower and fully restore the Great Hall and its medieval stained glass. The judges of a stonemasonry award actually called the restoration a textbook example of great care and skill. This incredible, decades-long effort successfully pulled a true masterpiece of romantic architecture right back from the brink of total annihilation.
Today, Highcliffe Castle is fully open to the public, featuring beautifully restored wings, tea rooms, and yes, access to that exact beach where princes once swam. So I'll leave you with this final thought. When you walk through those doors and look at stones carved in France centuries ago, which overlooked story are you going to discover? Will you connect with the eccentric vision of a diplomat, the incredible philanthropy of Rose Selfridge, or maybe the sheer grit of the craftsmen who pieced those ruins back together? I highly encourage you to go check out the exhibitions and experience this stunning architectural puzzle for yourself. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and keep learning.